Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something that is absolutely fundamental to how our societies function, the machinery of democracy, specifically administrative accountability. Think about it. What keeps the massive power of the state in check? We're looking at the invisible gears that literally keep government bureaucracy from running away with its own power. Because, let's face it, unchecked bureaucracy is an ever-present threat. So, let's get into it. Renowned political scientist V.O. Key hit the nail on the head. He defined this concept as the fundamental method by which administrative officials and government agencies are held answerable for their acts to those who actually bear political responsibility, namely the chief executive and the legislature. Basically, accountability is the essential safety valve of our democracy. Without it, the vast power handed to government agencies could, and probably would, warp into autocratic behavior. Imagine for a second a public official with unlimited funds and zero oversight. Yeah, it's a scary thought. That is exactly what this mechanism prevents. Which brings us to a more formal definition. Administrative accountability is the vital mechanism, really the sum total of all constitutional, statutory, administrative, and judicial roles used to check bureaucracy and hold public officials strictly answerable for their actions. Why does this matter so much right now? Well, as modern state activities increase and government bureaucracies grow larger and, frankly, more powerful, we absolutely need these established rules. They are the only way to protect citizens from the abuse of power. Here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll define administrative accountability. Then, we'll look inside the machine at internal controls. Third, we'll step back to look at outside oversight, meaning the external controls. And finally, we'll wrap up with judicial review and public power. All right, starting with Section 1, defining administrative accountability. I want you to picture the government as a massive, incredibly powerful engine. In an engine that big, it requires constant, meticulous monitoring. Now, this monitoring takes two distinct forms. First, we have internal control. These are mechanisms fitted right within the administrative machinery itself. They operate within the organization, usually via a strict hierarchy or parallel executive agencies. Think of it like a boss managing a subordinate down the chain of command, just making sure daily tasks are done right. Then, on the flip side, we have external control. These are the agencies or institutions that sit entirely outside that machinery. They provide an independent check on power, ensuring transparency and legality. So if a rogue official tries to quietly bypass a budget, internal controls are the passwords blocking their access, while external controls are the independent auditors who catch them if they actually manage to slip through. Moving on to Section 2, inside the machine, internal controls. Now, it's fascinating to see how the fundamental chain of command shifts depending on a country's specific constitution. In a parliamentary system, the prime minister and the cabinet sit right at the apex of the executive branch. The PM directs the ministers, who then, in turn, control the civil administrators. But if you look at a presidential system, the president is the all-powerful chief executive at the very top. The president controls the ministers, who further check the civil administrators. So the actual flow of administrative control is deeply tied to the system of government itself. But regardless of the system, there are several internal mechanisms universally applied to keep things running smoothly. First is the hierarchical order. It's a ladder structure, creating very clear superior-subordinate links. Then you have the Annual Confidential Report, or ACR. These are those yearly assessments of an employee's work, attitude, and commitment that directly affect their career progression. It keeps people accountable. There's also budgetary control, meaning departments absolutely must get finance ministry approval before incurring any expenditures. Not a single dime is spent without it. We also see efficiency surveys, where superiors conduct field inspections to keep management on their toes. And finally, administrative leadership. Good, charismatic leaders play a vital role in boosting morale and inspiring efficiency from within. These are the everyday governors keeping the bureaucracy from going off the rails. Next up, Section 3, outside oversight, external controls. Let's zoom out a bit. So, leaving the internal office dynamics behind, let's look at the massive constitutional forces operating on the outside. Because, let's be real, we don't just trust the government to police itself, right? That's where external controls provide a crucial, independent check on power. We have legislative oversight, where elected parliaments use question hours, debates, and committees, like the Public Accounts Committee, to scrutinize policies. Then there's broader executive control, where chief executives manage things via policymaking, budget prep, recruitment, and executive orders. And crucially, we have the ombudsman. This is an independent official totally dedicated to investigating citizen complaints regarding maladministration, unfairness, or unnecessary delay. Finally, we rely heavily on financial and audit institutions. Independent bodies like an auditor general ensure absolute financial propriety and efficiency. These are vital diagnostic tools for the health of our democracy. I want to pause for a second, specifically on the power of the legislature. Here is the bottom line. No money can be spent unless appropriated by an act of the legislature. This is the classic power of the purse, and it acts as the single most effective check against autocratic behavior by the executive. If the administration wants to act, it needs the money to do it, and that money, it requires democratic approval. But what happens when internal rules fail and legislative budgets aren't quite enough to stop an abuse of power? That brings us to Section 4, Judicial Review and Public Power. When everything else breaks down, the courts step in. Through judicial review, the courts meticulously examine the legality of administrative actions. They are there to ensure that government agencies respect due process, that they act strictly within their legal powers, and above all, that they uphold the rule of law. And to do this, the judiciary has some incredibly powerful, specific tools. Let's break down 4 of these vital legal orders nice and slow. The first tool is habeas corpus. Now, this translates to produce the body. It's a judicial order requiring a person to be physically produced before a court at a specific time. The court then determines whether they are being detained legally or illegally by the state. This is literally the ultimate direct shield against unlawful government detention. Next, we have mandamus. This is a judicial order issued directly to a public authority, compelling them to perform a specific action that they are legally expected to do. If a government agency is just dragging its feet or refusing to process a legal request, mandamus is essentially the court stepping in and forcing that stalled bureaucratic gear to turn. On the flip side of that is prohibition. Just like it sounds, this is a judicial order that explicitly prohibits any public authority from performing an action that it is not legally entitled to do. If an official is overstepping their boundaries and abusing their power, prohibition serves as the court's emergency brake. And finally, we have quo warranto, which translates to by what warrant. This is a judicial order asking a public official to formally provide legal justification for their assumption of a particular office. It's the legal mechanism ensuring that only authorized, legally appointed individuals are allowed to pull the levers of public power. But beyond the courts, accountability ultimately rests with society itself. Social and public accountability happens through civil society directly monitoring government action. We see this all the time through media investigations and public hearings. We see it through modern digital transparency portals that track every single government expense. It happens through citizen satisfaction surveys, the organization of pressure groups, advisory committees, and, fundamentally, through the power of elections and recall mechanisms. Which leads us to our final and honestly most important point: vigorous public opinion. This is the ultimate form of external accountability. It happens when civil society actively participates in scrutinizing government actions and demanding transparency. The entire complex machinery we just talked about, the internal hierarchies, external audits, judicial reviews, they all exist to serve the public. But they also absolutely require the public to pay attention. You, the citizen, are the final crucial component of external oversight. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. Are the internal and external gears of accountability actually enough to protect democracy without a vigorous, vigilant public to watch them? The machinery is built, but it requires our eyes to keep it running true. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.